Hi, and welcome to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly show about finance, money, and investing. I'm your host, Ray Treverson from OTG Capital. We broadcast weekly on Radio Northern Beaches in the beautiful Northern Beaches area of Sydney, Australia, and we go around the country on Community Radio Network through the Community Broadcasting Association of Australia. So welcome to our regional listeners that come in. We're up around 14, 15 different stations now around the countryside. So thank you for listening in. We always appreciate your comments. And again, it's really nice that us city folk are getting out and having a chat, because what we're talking about, ladies and gentlemen, always pervades all of the country. It's not just a city-country kind of thing. Superannuation law, and we're actually going to be covering that off today, covers everybody. So I'd like to welcome back to the microphone Stuart Sheary, who is a subject matter expert from the Institute of Financial Professionals Australia. You used to know them as the Taxpayers Association, and they've been around for over 100 years. So they know what they're talking about. And I'm really pleased to have Stuart back. He knows what he's talking about. And today we are focusing on dependence when it comes to superannuation. So Stuart, welcome to the show.
Ray, thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Now, look, Stuart, I'm really pleased to have you on the show because it's really topical at this point in time. We are seeing some of the biggest changes occurring in superannuation law that is being passed by the government at this point in time. And there are things happening in payday super. There are things happening with caps and limits and what you can and can't contribute. But what I wanted to cover off with you today, and I think it's really, really important, is some misconceptions around who gets the money and what happens to that money when someone dies in superannuation. Now, again, what's fascinating is that when you look at the statistics, a lot of people die with a lot of money still sitting in super, which is kind of fascinating because they don't understand when they get to super, they're supposed to spend it. Okay.
So prudent.
And so, a lot of people sit there and go, well, no, it's intergenerational wealth transfer. I'm going, no, that's not the way the system was set up. Super was set up for you to retire comfortably on, and it's not meant for intergenerational wealth transfer, but it becomes that vehicle, doesn't by default, I guess, Stuart, isn't that the case?
Yeah, that's a good observation. I guess one of the traps people fall into when they've got super is that they think they should only take the minimum pension, and they can take a little bit more than that. So that's perhaps one of the reasons why they're left with a little bit too much in super upon passing.
And again, I don't give financial advice to people. I'm not licensed to anymore. I used to be many, many years ago. But, I look at them and say, their primary reason for not taking too much out is they want to leave a legacy for their kids. And I totally get that. But again, then when they get to a certain age, they start coming up against SISA laws, the superannuation laws that says, you've got to start drawing down. And so I say to people, you understand that by the time you reach your 90s, it's supposed to be zero. Okay, you're supposed to be close to zero by that point. And they go, oh, really? And I said, that's the way it's designed. So today, Stuart, I want to talk about dependence and why this matters, because I guess let's talk about the scenario now when a superannuant dies. Okay, so they've set up their super, they've been living on the pension from their super fund for a little while now, and as it's going to happen to all of us one day, sooner or later, that person dies. Now, at that point in time, there's some real basic assumptions that occur. And what's that first one? I'm going to prod you, I guess, with my stick and say, Stuart, what's the first assumption that people make when, it comes to money in super? Where do they get
the first thing they assume is that money in super can go to whoever they want. Well, first of all, ideally, the money goes to the person you want. So first step, I think, would be to make sure we have what we call a binding nomination. So write to your super fund, complete their form, and direct the superannuation fund to pay your death benefit to the person you want, okay? But unfortunately, not everyone you want will be what we call a superannuation dependent, meaning the super fund will not pay it to that person. So you might have to direct it towards your estate, and it's the estate that will direct your superannuation death benefit in that scenario.
And I guess that's the big assumption, is everybody thinks that it's all in the will. And the last will and testament is an incredibly important document. I'm not trying to lessen its impact, but when it comes to what's sitting in super, we've got to make clear and unambiguous nominations totally separate to the will, don't we?
Exactly. So superannuation is not ordinarily an estate asset. So ordinarily, the super trustee will pay it to a living person directly. They're not going to pay it to necessarily the estate. They can, if there's no what we call superannuation law dependent, they might pay it to the estate, or they might pay it to the estate if you direct the superannuation fund to do that, but not by default, as you're alluding to.
Okay, so let's now talk a bit about definitions. All right, so there's a couple of definitions that I think we need to look at, and the first one is super law, and the second one is tax law. So let's talk about, in super law, who can the fund pay?
Good point. So superannuation law decides who can receive that superannuation death benefit. Who can I tell the superannuation fund to pay that death benefit to via a binding nomination, for example? And those people include an ordinary financial dependent. So someone who is wholly reliant on you financially to maintain their normal standard of living. But it expands beyond that to include people like a spouse, a child of any age, and someone in what we call an interdependent relationship. So they're all superannuation law dependents.
Okay, so that dependency, I think, becomes a subject now for, I think, further discussion, doesn't it? Because some people are going to think, well, they're dependent, but it's not necessarily the case when it comes to the tax office or superannuation law. So let's go through a little bit about that. We talk about whether somebody is financial dependent or are they interdependent. I mean, and again, we need to be very clear and pass this language because it's important when it comes down to who gets paid and who doesn't.
Yeah, so we talked about who can receive the superannuation directly from the super fund, but how is that death benefit going to be taxed when it's paid to that beneficiary? So you might have a scenario where, yes, the super fund can pay an adult child who is a cis dependent, but that adult child will not necessarily receive the full proceeds because it's going to be subject to tax because they're not a tax dependent. So a tax dependent will receive superannuation death benefit lump sum tax-free. It's great. But a non-tax dependent, their superannuation death benefit will be subject to tax. So that's why we've got to distinguish between cis dependency and tax dependency. Yes, they might be a cis dependent and can receive it directly from the super fund, but that death benefit may be subject to tax.
And I'm going to save this question probably the second half of the show because there's a little hack that financial planners will tell you about. You can look it up on the internet, ladies and gentlemen. It's not illegal, but we're now talking about money that sits in a super fund that is considered taxed and money that is non-taxed. And again, there's what they call a recontribution strategy that certainly I've advised my previous clients, but again, it's a perfectly legal thing to do, but it's vitally, vitally important, particularly if all your kids get older. Once they've all passed 18, they then are no longer a dependent. And so, Stuart, as you rightly said, should that person die and that money is bequeathed on from the super fund, it is going to be subject to quite a bit of tax. So we've got to be looking at that. Now, let's talk about tax law. And according to tax law, who receives this benefit, this death benefit, tax-free, and who doesn't?
Great point. So people who might receive a superannuation death benefit tax-free include people like the spouse. So a spouse is both a cis law dependent and a tax law dependent. So the spouse will always receive a superannuation death benefit lump sum tax-free. A minor child will receive a superannuation death benefit lump sum tax-free too. Interestingly, a former spouse is a tax dependent, but not a superannuation dependent. So what that means is they would have to receive it via the estate, but the estate would not have to withhold any tax on that lump sum payment. So there can be a little bit of a nuance there as to who is a tax dependent and who is a superannuation dependent. And of course, with tax dependents, they also include people who are wholly reliant on the deceased, to maintain their normal standard of living.
So I guess when we're talking about dependency, and again, I throw in the mix here, we've got a lot of discussion these days around NDIS, and we're talking, I know of personal circumstances. Just walked in the door this morning after my wife had coffee with friends where there's an estate brouhaha because one of the beneficiaries from this particular death of the parents, they both died within a couple of weeks of each other. There's lots of kids. They're all reasonably well off, but one of them has been financially dependent because of mental disability. And wow, all of a sudden, I remember I've had estate lawyers on my show on a number of occasions, and they've said to me, Ray, you have no idea what can happen when all of a sudden houses, particularly because houses now are costing so much and they're worth a lot, how much brouhaha starts happening when an estate goes up for battle. And again, I heard this story. It's an anecdote, and I'm certainly not going to relay names and places, but it just becomes incredibly difficult. And again, I'm going to get to this in the second part of the show. And speaking of, we're just about at halftime. You're here on Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly show about finance, money, and investing. I'm really pleased to have at the microphone this week Stuart Sheary. He's a subject matter expert from the Institute of Financial Professionals of Australia, the old Taxpayers Association. And we're going to be seeing those guys soon at a national conference where all these wonderful accountants get together. It's such an exciting time, 2 days of accountants, wall-to-wall accountants. I can't tell you, I'm brimming. Sorry, I shouldn't be like that.
It'll be a great day, Ray. It's going to be a great day.
It'll be a great couple of days. But again, it's one of those things that may be boring, but this stuff at the end of the day is vitally, vitally important. And even if you don't soak it all in, make sure that you get some key points. I always like to leave key takeaways, and we'll leave you with a few. So let's take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment here on Dollars and Making Sense. Hi, and thank you for listening to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly radio program about finance, money, and investing on Radio Northern Beaches and nationally on the Community Radio Network around Australia. The views, comments, and opinions aired during our program should not be construed or viewed as financial advice. Any commentary is general advice only and does not take into account your objectives, financial situation, or needs. You should consider whether the advice is suitable for you and your personal circumstances. If in doubt, you should contact an authorised licensed financial planner. We welcome questions and feedback, and you can get in touch with us via our blog, social media channels, or email. Please search for Dollars and Making Sense in your favourite podcast platform, or check out our blog at otgcapital.com.au/blog. Hi, and welcome back to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly show about finance, money, and investing. I'm your host, Ray Treverson. We are really pleased to have at the microphone this week Stuart Sheary. He's a subject matter expert on superannuation and a number of other great matters, and he's part of the Institute of Financial Professionals of Australia. You may have known him in the past as the Taxpayers Association. It's an organisation that's been around for over 100 years. They've got about 4,000 plus permanent members, I think it is, Stuart, and literally thousands and thousands of people on a daily and weekly basis visit their website for knowledge. So tax agents all around the country are well known to IFPA, and we've got a national conference coming soon. So I'm going to be rubbing shoulders with a whole bunch of accountants and tax agents. I can't wait. But this week we are talking about dependency when it comes to superannuation and what happens when someone dies. Now, before we went to the break, Stuart, we were talking about the taxable component and the non-taxed component in superannuation. It comes down to what is concessional contributions or non-concessional contributions. And one of your colleagues, Natasha Panagis, who's been on the show, we've talked about CCs and NCCs till the cows come home. Now, we mentioned a recontribution strategy, and you picked up on something while we're at our break that we need to come back and talk about, because in certain circumstances, so I don't want to steal your thunder. So talk a little bit about contribution strategies that we were talking while we're off air.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, superannuation death benefits can be taxed when paid to a non-tax dependent if there's what we call a taxable component. And taxable components generally arise through earnings in the super fund and what we call concessional contributions. So your super guarantee, your personal deductible contributions, they all build up your taxable component. But we really like the tax-free component of a superannuation death benefit because that's received tax-free regardless of the beneficiary. And that tax-free component comprises of what we call non-concessional contributions. So personal contributions for which no deduction was claimed. So we can build up that tax-free component by making non-concessionals. And one strategy that's quite common amongst financial planners is to suggest to clients to perhaps withdraw a lump sum tax-free because they're met a condition of release and they're over the age of 60, and then recontribute that back in as a non-concessional contribution. So we're withdrawing taxable component. It's tax-free to the member because they're over the age of 60, met a full condition of release, and now they're putting it back in as a non-concessional, increasing the tax-free component so that when they pass away, if there's any money left in the super fund, ideally, as you're alluding to, we've depleted as much of that superannuation fund as possible, but if there is some left in the superannuation fund, that's received tax-free to the beneficiary regardless as to who they are.
Now, we were talking though off air that if somebody knows they're just about to depart the mortal coil and they start doing this in a rushed manner just before they kick the bucket, it could be construed as potential tax avoidance, couldn't it?
Yeah, well, on an extreme scenario, let's just say we're terminally ill and we've been advised we're going to pass away next week, and then we do this, what we call recontribution strategy. We pull money out and then put it in the next day. Then there is a risk that could be construed as tax avoidance because the question arises, well, why did you do that? There's certainly a tax benefit there. There's the tax saving that's going to be made by not having to pay tax on that death benefit. And the question arises, well, why did you implement that arrangement? And so that's why we should really be thinking about these things much earlier, well before death is on the horizon, because there may it's less easy, if you like, to see that as tax avoidance because there may be no tax benefit. We may spend all the superannuation. Whether or not there is a tax benefit in the end is much less certain. Why? Because how do you calculate that tax benefit when death is not even foreseeable?
Yeah, that's true. So look, one of the things I'd like to do, because I think case studies are a great way of explaining some of the differences between dependency and what is and is not constituted, I guess, in tax law compared to superannuation law. And I'm looking at this wonderful slide that you sent to me about Anne and Lottie. So I was thinking for the audience, we go through that, and I'll get my video editor to actually post this as part of our YouTube video. But maybe, Stuart, if you go through that dependency slide, do you have that with you at the moment?
I don't, but I have it on the top of my head there from recollection. There's two girls, and they're both in the same scenario in the sense that they're both age 20 and they're both going to university. They're both smart. They're both attending medical school. One of them is from a wealthy family, and she receives ongoing support from her parents to meet her standard of living. So she doesn't work, and she's fully reliant on the support of her father, in this case, to keep her alive and keep her accustomed or keep her normal standard of living, which is quite high. She has a great standard of living. She's living it up. We've then got another girl who's in the same position. She's age 20, studying medicine, and she receives a small stipend or small amount of money each week from her father. Now, she largely supports herself. She is working part-time. She's receiving a little bit of government assistance, and the money that she receives each week is much smaller. And you would argue that not her standard of living isn't entirely dependent on her father. Now, in that scenario, if both their fathers passed away, interestingly enough, it's the girl who was fully reliant on her father for her standard of living that would be considered a tax dependent, and would receive that money tax-free, versus the girl who was not fully reliant on her father. She would have to pay tax on that death benefit, or rather the super fund would withhold tax on that death benefit.
Gosh, it almost brings a bit of a subtle tear to my eye. It's like, wow.
I know, it sounds very unfair, doesn't it, Ray? I mean, the poor girl, she's got of low means, she's self-sufficient, and her death benefit is taxed, whereas her friend is not working, fully reliant on dad, and her death benefit is tax-free. It's sad, but that's the law.
So, ladies and gentlemen, for those that are listening, Stuart's slide says Lottie's father leaves her a $1 million death benefit, so that's the rich gal, and Anna's father leaves her with a 100K benefit. That's the one that's on meager rations. So Lottie's $1 million is actually tax-free, and Anna's father's 100K will be taxed at Anna's marginal rate less 15%, if I'm correct.
No, the death benefits are subject to a maximum rate of tax of 15%, if it's what we call taxed element.
There we go.
15%. If there's insurance in there, it gets a little bit more complicated. It can even be higher than 15% tax.
Right. That's why we have the expert here, ladies and gentlemen. I supposed incorrectly. So look, one of the things I want the listeners to be abundantly clear on is this differentiation between tax law and superannuation law when it comes to dependency, because I think, we talked about it briefly when we opened the show about assumptions. Okay. The old thing, assume, makes an ass out of you and me. That's an old teacher taught me that one many, many years ago, and it's still very relevant. It's, you break up the word assume, ladies and gentlemen, ASS, you and me, okay, makes an ass out of you and me. So the big assumption, okay, superannuation is not part of estate planning, of a last will and testament. There are things that can go in there. Sorry, Stuart, I'm stealing thunder. I should throw back to you. So let's make the big differentiation between what happens in a will and what happens in a superannuation fund.
Yeah, so glad you raised that, Ray. I probably should have mentioned that earlier. So if a death benefit is paid directly to, say, a non-tax dependent, the superannuation fund will withhold the applicable tax. Now, if that death benefit is instead paid to the estate, the executor of the will is actually liable to pay tax on that death benefit, depending on who they pay. So if the executor of the estate decides to pay it to the spouse, then they don't have to pay any tax on that superannuation death benefit. If they're paying it to a cousin of the deceased, then yes, they'll need to withhold 15% tax on the taxable tax component of that death benefit.
Yeah, and again, I think one of the things, and we mentioned this already during the show, I've had estate lawyers on this show, and the myriad of issues that can come up when we're talking about wills and what happens to people's estate. And I never forget, I said, where do you start? And he said, with a piece of paper and a pencil. He said, that's the best place to start, and it's to start working out what's there and how it may depend and who's necessarily going to be putting their hand up. And again, I think when it comes to dependency, it's easier, I think, in the cold light of day. Stuart, how often do you see at IFPA, at the Institute, where you're being asked to not necessarily adjudicate, but I guess advise on the law specific to these kind of situations, when it comes to dependency? Is this fairly regular occurrence?
Yeah, it does come up a lot, like insofar as, well, here's a set of facts. Is this individual or this adult child, more often than not, what we call a financial dependent? They're receiving a little bit of money from their parents. The kids might even be in their 40s, and they're just receiving a small amount. Does that make them a financial dependent? And so more often than not, though, the answer is no. So I'd argue it's quite clear, the law in most cases, but it's certainly a topic that comes up a lot.
I'm curious, in those situations though, Stuart, does the tax office apply some discretion, or I can't imagine that this is a hard and fast rule, and that the commissioner sooner or later, and when I say the commissioner or his or her delegates, would then be I guess, tasked with having some discretion or making some discretionary decision around dependency and whether they are tax or super dependent when it comes to paying tax on death benefits. Is that something that you see often?
Well, there's a lot of private binding rulings there. So a lot of people will write into the ATO and say, hey, ATO, here are the facts. Do you think I am a financial dependent? And yes, the ATO will apply the law to those facts. I'm not sure if there's too much discretion there. It's really a question of was the deceased fully reliant? Was the beneficiary fully reliant on the deceased for their normal standard of living? And so that will be decided on the facts.
So there's an avenue then for people to write to the tax office to get some sort of ruling in that case. Okay,
absolutely.
So that's a good takeaway.
Offers private binding ruling. So if you have any uncertainty there, you can always write into the ATO on a tax matter, and they can clarify your situation.
Brilliant. Well, that's a good takeaway. That together with, we'll put some of these slides into our post. Stuart, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Always highly, highly educational. And again, these assumptions, ladies and gentlemen, they can kill you. So make sure you know. And there's great information on the IFPA website. There's also great information on Money Smart, which is the government website. Stuart Sheary from the Institute of Financial Professionals. Thank you again for being on Dollars and Making Sense.
That's all right. Have a great day.
And to you too. Bye-bye.